Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, How to Build Business Resilience During a Global Polycrisis. My name's Stephen Edwards, and for SEMA in the northwest of England and North Wales, I chair a team of volunteers who put together these events. And if you're interested in getting involved with that and shaping the way we do things, there will be in the chat, there we go, the Area 6 email address. So you can drop your details there, and we'd welcome ideas of topics, venues, and speakers. I'm delighted today to be joined by Andrew Tollington, co-founder and director of SIRV Systems Limited, who are a team of technology, computer and data scientists committed to making UK business more resilient. Just before I hand over, please note, to minimise disruption, you've all been automatically muted. If you'd like to ask a question, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end, in the top right-hand corner, you'll see a question mark, and you can drop questions in there. And following this, you'll be sent a link of the recording and a short survey for feedback, in which you can also suggest future topics. And now it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and hello one and all. I'm here in London and delighted to be joining you all. Just one point before we dive into the slides, I would suggest that there is no such thing as a stupid question. So please do ensure that if you have any questions or queries, do use the option there and fire away with the questions or save until later on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to take a look at how to build resilience during a global polycrisis. The session is 1 hour in total. We have about 45 to 50 minutes of me speaking, and then we'll hand over for questions. We are going to address the 3 points I've highlighted here. I'm going to, at the outset, define what is a polycrisis and what do I mean by business resilience. We're going to look at how to boost our situational awareness, effectively get up to speed on what's happening in the world. And then we're going to have a look at how can we then do something about this, some conceptual mechanisms which will help you record and then go out and find open intelligence sources to help you put together something called a horizon scanning model. Before we get into the content, just a note about me. As Stephen said, I'm the CEO of a company called SIRV, that's Systematic Intelligent Risk Valuation. Thankfully, we abbreviated that, and we're an artificial intelligence-led business helping organizations with their business resilience. And I have on the board some people which are integrated into the emergency and security services, which means some, not all of the things that I talk about with you today will be information which is, all of it is publicly available, but most of it, some of it is hard to find. And therefore I'll be sharing that with you in this one space. I'm also chair of the Artificial Intelligence in Risk Management Committee at the ISRM. The ISRM is a global network of 40,000 people. It stands for Institute of Strategic Risk Management. Effectively, everyone on there is either a practitioner or an academic in risk management. And when I talk about risk management here and hereafter, I'm talking about operational risk management rather than financial risk management. And I'm a qualified SEMA accountant. Delighted to have qualified as a SEMA accountant. I was on a graduate scheme and I got invited to join the finance team and then got sponsored to do SEMA. Absolutely loved studying it, changed everything for me. So really hugely happy to be here among my fellow colleagues and very happy to have been and qualified SEMA accountant in the past. Let's then get on to defining what is meant by polycrisis and business resilience. So a polycrisis is effectively many crises at once. And this can take two forms. Over to the right here, we have a report written about disasters happening at once during a period of time between 2020 and 2021 in the Gulf of Mexico. They had not only the backdrop of COVID-19, they also had 7 severe catastrophic hurricanes and bitingly cold winters, all of which means their state of normal is no longer normal. And an event-driven view focuses on the symptoms rather than the root causes of disaster losses. Effectively, their business as usual over this period of time was totally lost, and they were in a constant state of flux, which brings with it its own problems because we just think that's how things are. We also have another definition of a polycrisis, something like COVID-19 happening and the debts that left us with and the behavioural changes. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, following the invasion in 2014 by Russia, which then led to a spike in costs and a huge amount of money had to go towards to support that. And then, of course, there's an enduring risk ongoing, which is cybercrime, and then state actors getting more heavily involved with trying to bring down our digital systems here in the UK and elsewhere in the West. So polycrisis can be you have one place at one time, which is enduring lots of crises, or you can have these kind of background crises that are ongoing, which appear to be interdependent, maybe, but you can't quite put your finger on it when you're amongst it all. And then business resilience, what do we mean by that? It's the ability to avoid, mitigate, respond to, and recover from major shocks, threats, and challenges. If I was to transform that into a human being, it would be someone that a business resilient or a human resilient is someone who has effectively built up a level of fitness, which means that they can be impacted by an accident or an illness, and they get back to normal far quicker because they're already in a great state of health. The UK government has responded to the business resilience agenda by putting forward a government resilience framework launched by Rishi Sunak, and we have an apolitical organisation called the National Preparedness Commission, and we have something called the Prepare campaign. And the Prepare campaign is a website that you can go to, you can type it in to do your web browser at your leisure, and there you'll find lots of practical advice about what you should do in response to certain disasters and catastrophes and high impact events. And at the bottom there, you'll see emergency alerts. You probably will recall receiving a text message at some point, and that would have been from the government because they have now adopted something which was rolled out in Australia many years ago, and that is effectively a mass notification alert system for when there are impending disasters coming our way. And these can be used at local level, for example, response to floods, or it can be used nationwide. So the government took the view that after COVID-19, we had a change in the relationship between the public and the government. We had a change in behaviours. Meanwhile, the geopolitical tectonic plates were altering all around the world, and the pace of change and the volume of high impact events were coming at once. And it would appear that that's going to be the way it's going to be for some time. In other words, the governments are struggling to keep up with things, and they recognise that businesses need to become far more resilient if they are to continue to be productive and profitable. This is different to something might be described as business continuity, which tends to be around keeping the lights on and making sure you have operations day to day. Business resilience is much more around the everyday state of your business, so you can receive impacts and shocks and recover on a day-to-day basis. So effectively, everything that you're doing, from supply chain to all of your support functions to your sales team, have ways of working which are resilient, and that's built into just how they do business. That's the crucial difference between something like business continuity and business resilience. And in the next few years, you'll hear the business resilience agenda being put forward much, much more, and it's likely to be an expectation. And in the sales cycle, you're likely to see organizations that might be buying from your organization saying to themselves and saying to suppliers, what have you got in the way of business resilience? So we've defined what business resilience is, and now let's take a look at our situation awareness and what do I mean by that. There are three big risks that we face, and I take this from an insurance conference very recently where the great and the good of the insurance world, who are experts in risk, have been for hundreds of years, were asked, what are the big risks? And these were defined as the three big risks that we face now and going forward. Firstly, cyber, which is everything to do with digital crime and disruption. Geopolitical risk, that's to do with politics and war. And the environmental risk. And all three of these are interrelated. For example, one might have a dispute with a foreign nation and they would equip themselves with cyber tools which they would then deploy as a means, as a weapon against you and your organization and your country. Equally, if you have an environmental disaster, you might then have a power outage which would impact your capacity to run anything digital because you have no more power. I don't intend today to really dive too deeply into the notion of cyber and cyber security because I believe a great deal of you have probably been very well educated by your IT directors, and it's something that people are very good now at teaching people about. So I'd like to focus really on the geopolitical changes in the environment and the environmental changes that we have ahead of us. All of these things, as I say, can then fold into a cyber impact and our digital world, but it's the geopolitical and environmental things which perhaps haven't got the necessary profile within businesses at the moment, but that will surely change in the next few years. So starting off with the geopolitical state that we have today. So here I have a map of the world, and we have three nations highlighted: Ukraine, Israel, Syria, and Taiwan. Now, the two in red are showing where there's a live conflict in Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's where possibly we're going to have another conflict. And then Syria is obviously a new addition here. Were this talk to be taking place a couple of weeks back, this probably would not be shown on here. There is something known as the axis of resistance. There's other names for it, but the axis of resistance is made up of four nations: North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia. And if we focus for the moment on Syria, we can start to see how all of these nations are interconnected. So if we start with Syria and go back to 2011, you may recall the Arab Spring or the Arab Uprising, and there were demonstrations across lots of different nations. And in Syria, there were demonstrations. And the Assad regime back in 2011, some people thought they might change because there had been talk of progressive leadership. However, by 2013, there were weapons and artillery being used on members of the public that were protesting for change. And in 2013, Barack Obama said that the red line would be the use of any chemical weapons because it was well known that the Assad regime had chemical weapons. That would be a red line. Were it to be crossed, then the United States would take action. However, there was chemical weapons used in 2013. 1,000 people were horrifically killed and mutilated by chemical weapons. And both the UK Parliament and then Obama decided not to take action. And many people in the geopolitical world see this as a turning point and as a green light to the axis of resistance to take part in bolder and bolder moves. So in 2014, we saw the annexation or the invasion of Crimea by Russia. And then we saw Russia getting involved in Syria with lending air support to the Assad regime. Roll forward to just recently, we've seen a couple of changes. To begin with, Ukraine has sucked in the Russian Air Force and the military even more than ever before. And we see Hezbollah having signed a peace declaration, or at least a temporary ceasefire with Israel. Both of these things meant that the rebels in Syria, led by HTS, said to themselves, we can make some strides forward, and within the last couple of weeks, they've been able to overthrow the Assad regime. Meanwhile, we have North Korea sending drones to Russia to help them with the fight with Ukraine. They've also sent 10,000 troops, and possibly another 100,000 troops from North Korea will follow. And we've had China supplying parts over to Russia to help them in their fight with Ukraine. Meanwhile, the US has said that it wants to end the war, and realistically, whether it was Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, the likelihood is that both of them would have wanted to extract themselves from the war in Ukraine, because they're most interested in what's going to happen with China, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. That is a very quick whistle-stop tour of the geopolitical situation that we have today, and it's known as a geopolitical recession because the world is more uncertain than at any time over the last 50 years. And there's lots of good publicly available sources to find information out about all of these different topics. The BBC covers it very well, and there's a very good podcast called The Briefing Room. And the next slide will be an extract from that podcast, where we have Professor Michael Clark talking about Ukraine. So, 1 second, sorry.
War in Ukraine is the front line in a global struggle to break the influence of the West across world politics. The rest of the world is standing back to see what happens. The global South is seeing what happens. And if they see that the West is humbled by this war, whatever happens in Ukraine, that will be a big step towards global transformation. And, if some sort of deal is imposed next year for a truce, Ukraine will lose maybe 20% of its territory. The Western world will lose about 100% of its political credibility.
So we have Professor Michael Clark of King's College London speaking just a couple of weeks back to the BBC on The Briefing Room, talking about how important it is that somehow whatever deal is done in Ukraine is a successful deal which doesn't signal weakness to the rest of the world. But meanwhile, in the backdrop, we have an ebbing influence over the world. You'll see the West is taking less and less leadership in resolving conflicts. And this is all part of the mega trends that we see across the world. Bill Burns and Richard Moore, CIA and MI6 respectively, famously back in September in the Financial Times, wrote an article in which they say the world order is under threat in a way we haven't seen since the Cold War. So I am involved personally in the business resilience technology, but I have been for probably the last 10 to 15 years. And ever since COVID-19 in the last couple of years, we've really seen a big dynamic change in the conversation in that particular space. And it's now risen up to the top of many governments' agendas. There's discussions around the next 3 to 5 years. Should governments across the world think about things like national service or preparing people to be in the reserve, etc. And I think that discussion will only be wider, and we're likely to see much more discussion in the public realm as politicians start to warm up the public to the idea that we need to move to a war footing. We need to expand and increase our expenditure on the military, and we probably need to double the amount that we're currently spending on the military. And that's going to impact, obviously, where our taxpayers' money goes, but also it's going to impact how we do business and with whom we do business. So that's the geopolitical landscape that we're faced with, ever changing as shown by Syria, and one that's moving at a pace that really we are no longer in control of. Then we have the environmental impact of climate change. And here I'm talking about the environment in the broad sense. So I am also talking about things such as the pandemic. And you might be surprised to hear that the number one risk on the UK risk register is another pandemic. So COVID-30 or the equivalent could well be a reality. There is a 25% likelihood given to us having another pandemic in the next 10 years. So that falls under the environmental risks. But other environmental risks that we're probably far more familiar with, perhaps those of us that live in the UK, less so this summer, but certainly some other summers we have seen rising heat. And here we have a graph showing the Met Office and the average UK temperature since 1884. X-axis is time, y-axis is temperature, and you can see that there is a steady increase. However, as the Met Office say, the extremes of temperature are changing far faster than the average temperature. So it's not just the temperatures that are increasing, it's the extremes of the temperature. So reaching the 40 degrees is going to be more frequent, and reaching all the way up to 50 degrees in certain countries is going to be much more likely. So we're going to have far more peaks and troughs than we've ever seen before. This again was being said with the backdrop of the storm that we've just been going through here in the UK for the last couple of days. Now, heat can have different impacts on people, particularly vulnerable people, and you'll see councils soon setting up spaces. There's already been discussions in the last couple of years of having shelters for people that either work outdoors or people that live outdoors, they're homeless people. And you'll start to see shelters where you can get cooled off. So there'll be cooling tents and cooling rooms will be areas allocated by local councils, and they have a duty to set those things up. So people working outdoors, people living outdoors are likely to be able to be invited into local council spaces and cool off. But here we have an extract from a report written back in 2023, which says high outdoor temperatures have a substantial negative effect on the productivity of skilled labour. Even when production takes place in a climate-controlled space, productivity reduces 0.83% for every 1 degree above a certain temperature. So the conversation is going to start to change, because even if we're in an air-conditioned environment, when we go home, how do we sleep? When we travel, how do we sleep? Therefore, it's going to also start to change how our working lives are planned, whether or not you come into work on those severe weather days, whether or not you make sure that certain people with particular conditions and health conditions come into work. How far is your car, if it's parked in a car park, how far is that car from the offices and the air conditioning? And these kind of things will be spoken about much, much more in the work environment. And then, of course, we have this. I have two images here of flooding from Pontypridd in Wales. So over to the left-hand side, we have flooding from 2020, and then we have flooding over to the right here of Pontypridd in 2024, just a few weeks ago. We had severe flooding in Valencia, and here in Wales, although no one died, clearly there was a lot of damage done. Now, flooding can be anticipated to some degree. We can use weather forecasts, satellite imagery, and then have sensors on the ground and on river beds and along the sidings to be able to determine the height of the river and then send out broadcasts. But clearly that did not work here in Wales, although Wales did say that there was a possibility of flooding. The more frequently we receive these alerts, the more likely that we are, as a workforce and as private individuals, to basically ignore the alerts. So there is the physics and the side of actually anticipating the weather, and then the physics of where does the river flow go. And remember that new buildings are being built all the time, which makes predicting river flows actually really difficult. You then have the communication and the alerting of that. So therefore you don't want to panic the public, but at the same time you want to warn them about it. And then you have the public response. If you're somebody that hears that there is a weather warning and there's a flood warning often and no flood actually occurs, the likelihood you will begin to ignore it. And we humans also suffer from something called hedonistic adaptation, which means, as you're seeing, we've bounced back, and we do tend to bounce back really quickly from negative events, which is fantastic in some ways. If we consider things such as COVID, we've gone back to normality pretty rapidly. However, it also means that we don't really think about the ongoing issues that we're having because we go back to normality far too quickly. So here we have flood defences in place. The warning was pretty generic, it wasn't specific. People didn't take any actions, and there again we had flooding. So the environmental impact is something we're going to have to live with. And this then folds into a wider question, a book recently produced by Peter Schwarstein, The Heat and the Fury, which looks at the notion of climate violence. So again, I pointed out earlier how we have the interdependencies between cyber, geopolitical and environmental. The environmental risk is also going to start to fold, or at least it does according to Peter. We're going to have some geopolitical issues arise which are actually put down to climate and something called climate violence. So he's done a lot of research to show that in actual fact, a lot of the conflicts that we see around the world, obviously a lot of the migration flows, are already to do with the changes in the environment and climate change. One, therefore, as an accountant might ask, what's it got to do with me? And this is a very good question. Depending on your role, I don't know the audience, what role you're in, you could have just qualified, you could be qualifying, you could be studying, you could be a CFO. But the impact of these will all have a flow through to the numbers that you see come through. Since COVID, obviously, we've had a lot of change in supply chains, from offshoring to nearshoring and onshoring. And also supply chains have clearly become a lot more expensive and a lot more uncertain. And the timing around when things will arrive, there's a lot more flex in that, but undoubtedly the cost of shipping has risen significantly. Forecasting, I used to work in a forecasting and strategic planning department, and forecasting now will be more difficult. And strategic planning, should we enter certain markets? What should we do if we do enter those markets? What kind of risks are there in those markets? Those kind of questions will also need to be asked, and they need to be asked much more now when we think about both cyber, geopolitical and environmental risks that I've outlined already. Hopefully that brings the situations back to your own jobs. If not, in any event, hopefully it helps make you a bit more aware about what's happening around the world. So now that I have put the frighteners on, as it were, and like any good boss would say, so what, and don't bring me problems, bring me solutions, I have over the next 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I'm going to outline some of the things, some of the places you can go to go and get resource and help you with this. The first thing, a bit like a P&L, a bit like a balance sheet, I find it very helpful to start to order our thoughts, and I particularly like conceptual frameworks which are visually appealing. The next framework I'm about to show you, you can use to communicate with multiple people, multiple stakeholders. One of the challenges you might face is you might have heard about all of this today. Now, how do I go away and communicate this to other people? Those people might be board members, these people might be in operations, etc. And I'm going to show you a model which I think is quite appealing at getting buy-in. So we have here something called the 3 horizons model, and for our purposes we're going to be doing some horizon scanning, and we have 3 horizons in different colors, and across the x-axis we have time and the y-axis we have strategic importance. So we have today, which is denoted by now, then we have the near term, mid-term and long term. Now of course those terms can be different according to the business that you're in. For example, pharmaceutical businesses might plan for 20 years, whereas if you run pop-up market stalls, you might only be interested in the now and the near term. So you can define the kind of length of time you want that to be. The strategic importance, low, medium and high, again is something that you would define as to what's important to your organization. What you effectively have are these 3 humps denoting different kinds of risks coming around at different times. The further we look out in time, the less data probably there will be which is available. And the more we know about those risks, then the more defined it will be. It doesn't necessarily mean that the risk changes where it sits on this model, but it does mean that perhaps it changes how we think about it and its impact. So this is the model which I would promote as a good visual tool. And the way that we go about creating this model and the exercise in itself is to throw some resources at the following 3 activities. The first of which is to gather intelligence. That is to ask who, what, where, when, why, how. This is classic journalistic integrity, where we effectively ask ourselves, who do we need to speak to? What is it that we're doing? What is it that something could happen to us? Where is it going to be? When's it going to be? Why on earth is it going to happen? And how is it going to happen? Then we look at that information and we pull that all together, and we then look to assess those different types of risks. We filter them, and then we look to gain deeper insight into them. So it might just go from something like a news article on something like the BBC website to a full specific report, which you might want to pay for to get a deepened insight onto that particular risk. And then from that, we take the different matters and we think to ourselves, what then would the potential impact on our business be? And we score the impact. We then prioritize those particular different factors, and then we allocate them time. Now, to do this exercise could well be a full-time job. And indeed, if you work in a large organization, you might have people doing exactly this. Unlikely, but possible. But this kind of research ideally would be performed by a different interdisciplinary team. In other words, you'd have someone from operations, someone from finance, someone from HR, all the different kind of disciplines, and you'd gather together to go out and fact find, agree a scope, and perform the intelligence exercise. And then you would all get together again, say in 2 to 3 weeks' time, and then start to go through those different factors and then eventually give them an impact score, prioritize them, and then give them time, as in when they will land. The important thing too is to make sure this is an ongoing process. So once you have done and performed your horizon scan and put together the model successfully, then you schedule to go back and have a look again. It might be that the entire exercise is not repeated for some time, say 12 months, but it might be that there are certain risks that you want to put a watching brief on, and then you'd read rather than 12 months' time. What you end up with is something like this, where effectively, again, on the x-axis, we have time, which goes from 0 to 2 years, 2 to 5 years, and 5 years plus. They can be different time periods, entirely up to you. And over on the y-axis, we have impact and likelihood. What's the likelihood of something happening? And if it did happen, how would that then impact our organization? And you'll see each of these circles has numbers on there. So number 1, number 4, each of these would denote a different kind of risk. If you wanted to make this more visually appealing, it might be that if we were to throw this up on a board report or a PDF presentation of some description, it might be worthwhile not having the numbers and actually having some sort of words on there or some sort of logo, some sort of indicator that helps us immediately see from this one page, what do I need to focus on and when do I need to focus on it? So something like the pandemic, which we've just gone through, is something that could potentially 25% likelihood of happening in the next 10 years. That would probably be something that I would suggest would sit within Horizon 1 because it's an enduring event and the likelihood might be not that high at the moment, but if it did happen again, as we all know, the impact would be considerable. If you're interested in this 3 Horizons model, which I think is a really good communication tool, then the Scottish Environment Protection Agency has an excellent case study of them actually going through the entire exercise. And that QR code there, if you take your phone and you take a picture of it, it will take you to the PDF for that 3 Horizons model. It's a really interesting insight into an organization, how they go about gathering the information, how they put together a team to look at the information, when do they meet, what do they then end up with saying these are our risks, etc. And it just saves you a whole load of pain and trouble if you wanted to put this forward as an exercise. Highly recommend that particular resource. I now propose to go into the final section of the talk and to look at where I would go around trying to get intelligence. In other words, where can we get information? I'm going to try and give you some shortcuts which will hopefully help you in that exercise. I don't know whether or not you come from a local business, whether you're international or national. So each of these resources could be replicated elsewhere if you're coming from different countries, but hopefully they help in any event. So I've got 3 different slides on different information sources. Here we have the government and more. So over to the left-hand side, we have the EPC. This is the Emergency Planning Committee. And these are, this is an organization, forgive me, it's Emergency Planning College. They're actually an organization set up by the government where you can go and get trained on emergencies. Then we have a National Preparedness Commission set up in 2022, which looks to promote business resilience. And they are apolitical, and you have one of the members is Toby Harris. He's Lord Toby Harris, who also chairs the group that I'm part of, the ISRM. I'm seeing him tomorrow at an event here in London. He's very active in that space. You'll find him listed there. They have the great and the good and most eminent people you can possibly think of who are on the National Preparedness Commission. There's a lot of good articles there. Then we have at the gov.uk, we have the local resilience forums. We have local resilience forums being set up. So if you go to that web link, you will find hopefully a local resilience forum that will put you in contact with other people. Here in London, there's a very well ran local resilience forum. There's lots of people that are part of that, and that will be replicated throughout the country. And then over to the far right, we have Prepare. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Prepare campaign. So at the moment, the website is prepare.campaign. I suspect that word campaign will be taken out at some point and it will be called something else, because this is something which will be enduring. And if you go to that website, it tackles certain things such as a CBRN attack, and it then says what you should do. There is really good, healthy, practical advice, such as if there is a power cut, for whatever reason, it's a really good idea to have a torch which you can recharge. In other words, a manually rechargeable torch. If you have something like that, it's far better than candles, and that's really super useful. If any of you have been in a power cut and your phone's died, you will know that things like rechargeable torches are super helpful. So the Prepare website has lots of help on there, and it can direct you to some super practical advice about what to do in certain situations. One of the interesting things, perhaps it's not picked up on necessarily on that website, is the impact of things like power cuts and what it would have, the impact that would then have on the nation in full, because we might have a natural disaster, we might in actual fact have someone hack the infrastructure and bring down our power systems. But some people would suggest that by day 3 of a power cut, we would see riots and civil unrest, not because people want to go out and get food, but just because people haven't had a warm shower for 3 days, and it happens to be in the winter, people get really unhappy by that time. So there's a lot of interdependencies, a lot of things which would happen which we just wouldn't necessarily know about. So if you go to the Prepare website, have a look at certain sorts of risks, just be aware that they won't all necessarily happen in isolation, and one thing can lead to another. If you're looking at going out to market and understanding what are the big risks that are out there, and you're trying to put together perhaps a report, perhaps starting out your horizons, scanning the 3 horizons model, the World Economic Risk Report, produced every year, gives you a really good feeling for all of the different risks worldwide. The UK government has a national risk register, which they only recently started to publish. There is a 2023 version available, dead easy to read, lots of information around the actual exercise of how to put together their risk register and how they performed it. And then if you want to keep up to date with changes geopolitically, people like Chatham House are well worth following. They have lots of free subscriber newsletters and publications, etc., which will keep you up to date. Then we have technology services, so people which provide technology which goes and does a lot of the legwork for you. I've highlighted there SIRV, that's our product, and then you have others like Data Miner and Everbridge. These are two big, vast American players. They'll cover the entire world. We cover the UK only, and all of these kind of technologies will do a number of things. They'll look for threats and risks to your organization. They'll help you notify relevant people and relevant authorities and communicate, and then they'll help you recover as quickly as possible from any disruption. And then underneath that, we have security operations centers. Lots of people now have what's called SOCs or GSOCs. GSOC is a global security operations center. This will encompass very often both cyber and physical. And this is the kind of thing that you might have seen in Minority Report or these kind of control rooms, war rooms, etc., where people sit with lots of big screens and it all looks very impressive. A lot of people have invested in dedicated rooms for this kind of thing. So they'll be resistant to attack. They'll be elevated a certain level off the ground floor to make sure that flood doesn't impact them. They've got their own unique power sources, all of these kind of good things. But there is an increasing move just recently to having distributed and virtual security operations rooms. In other words, people dial in from different places, perform the same job, but they're no longer located in one place. So a security operations center doesn't necessarily need to be defined geographically as a room any longer. Ultimately, at the end of all of that, we need to make a call on what do we do with these various risks. And ultimately, you have four options. You avoid the risk altogether. That doesn't mean necessarily putting your head in the sand, but it does mean perhaps taking evasive maneuvers. We mitigate by putting things in place to reduce down the risk and reduce down the likelihood of the risk. And when it does impact us, we're better at recovery. We transfer the risk. In other words, we get some insurance involved and we transfer the risk out to a third party. Or we just accept the risk, live with it, and charge accordingly. Penultimate slide, National Protective Security Authority. Some of you might have heard of this. Most, I suspect, probably not. The abbreviation, they've rebranded themselves. The abbreviation now is NPSA, November Papa Sierra Alpha, NPSA. The NPSA sit with people like GCHQ and MI5, and they align themselves with many of the security services. If you are interested, if you're based in the UK and you are interested in perhaps helping transmit the message about some of the risks to people in your organization, and you don't believe necessarily all of those risks are being taken that seriously, perhaps you want it to be a standing agenda. Operational risk, you want to be a standard agenda on the board agenda, something on those lines. However you might want to move things forward, the NPSA does allow and does conduct private information sessions which last for 2 hours, and those sessions are held online, and I suspect you would probably be screened in advance. But if you wanted to get involved with that, if you contact me, I will then put you in contact with the right person to speak to about getting one of their security briefings. They are both highly entertaining, whilst of course at the same time very worrying. So it's really worthwhile taking part in and trying to get access to that. I couldn't recommend it enough. And part of their job is to go out into the world and spread the message about the risks that we face. That is it from me. I have 2 QR codes on here. The top QR code, if you scan that, would take you to my LinkedIn account. If you wanted to connect to me on LinkedIn, you are most welcome. And the second QR code takes you to our website address. And then below here, we have my email address and telephone number. If any of you would like to find out more about the kind of subject matters that I've discussed, if you want to find out about the general space and the firmament, about different technologies in this space, different organizations you could speak to. If you want me to come in and speak on a particular matter, more than welcome to do that, more than happy to do that. Very happy to connect and talk to anybody. Hopefully, the last 45 minutes have helped give you a sense of heightened situational awareness within our operating environment. And I would close with this. The NATO alliance did not have a regional detailed plan for the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. They now have a 360 plan and are very, very detailed plans for another invasion. What I'm saying there is that if NATO can be behind the curve in 2022, then if you or your organization is, it's not the end of the world. There is still time to respond. And with that, I shall defer and hand over to Stephen. I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Andrew. Some really useful information there and some really useful sources. We've had a few questions come in, so I'll just sort of press through them a little bit. What do you see as the finance stroke CFO role in this operational risk management? Or is it better placed under CEO or CIO, for example?
Well, I think the natural disposition of a CFO, a finance director, is one of, if I recall my training correctly, prudence and risk, awareness of risk. And very often you'll have some operational faculties. For example, real estate might actually plug into the finance director's remit. And real estate, that whole sector, of course, that's your hard physical assets. Could well be impacted by any of these three big risks. So I think it's important that one is able to challenge other people around the board table. In other words, to say, have you thought about this when you put together your forecasts or your budgets, about your expenditure, and to have it's effectively stopping the wool being pulled over your eyes. If you don't have direct line responsibility, it's important to be able to challenge other people. But at the same time, just personally, if I was putting together a budget and signing off, I would want to know that decent thought has been put behind the variances and the resilience behind things like supply chains. So things not all going well because the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea have attacked some shipping. Hopefully, so it doesn't feed directly into the world of a CFO, but I think it's part of the firmament that we definitely need to be aware of. I hope that answers the question, Stephen.
Yeah, I think so. And sort of, how do you then stop information getting into the wrong hands? For example, people or organizations wanting to deliberately disrupt things, such as the Russian government.
How we stop people getting in, well, that comes under a lot more information security. So clearly it's information and it's security around that information. It'd be very important to ensure that you have someone, and that's not cyber security, that's information security. So it's very important that you have your information security and you have people dedicated to that task, and or you have individuals that have that responsibility for ensuring that that information is secure and kept behind. The best way to think of it is layers. So whenever I talk to anyone in the physical digital world in security, which I do often, obviously, they'll always talk about layers. So it's about having certain protocols and security layers. Certain information is kept here, certain information is kept there, and to get to that endpoint is more and more difficult, because it could be that when you get, say, it's 5 layers deep, by the time layer 3 is penetrated by a foreign actor, you are aware of that, and so any damage that's been done has not been critical. So think about your critical systems, think about your critical information, and ask the question, how many layers have to be penetrated before you can get to those critical systems or the critical information?
Okay. And then sort of lumping two things together, you talked about COVID recovery, and I think there's been a certain amount of business recovery there. And also, there's still the impact of Brexit having changed things. And we see in the sort of FD space, some people are seeing falling vacancies and pressures on salaries. Have you got any thoughts on how those sort of things all feed together, and any
So,
advice?
so are you suggesting that effectively the labour market is contracting and it's more difficult to recruit and retain the best staff?
Yeah, and I think there's some people are seeing reductions in opportunities for FDs, and some pressure on salaries.
Well, the notion of business resilience takes investment, and wars take investment, and preparing for wars take investment, and building sea walls takes investment, right? So all of these things effectively require money to be moved elsewhere. So you're talking about moving from 2% of GDP to 4% of GDP if the US leaves NATO, for example. That's what some people are talking about. That's a significant chunk of money going elsewhere. So effectively, those kind of economic conditions, we've got a lot of headwind and I wouldn't use the word depression, but we are being compressed and squeezed. The flip side to that, and of course, I work in artificial intelligence, right? There is a huge potential upside to be made through really clever automation and innovation through artificial intelligence. So I think it's quite often that people put technology and they say technology will save us. And I'm afraid to some degree, I'm going to say that I think technology is a genuine opportunity which will help us rebuild margins. But at the same time, I think as we've all seen, we probably all feel poorer and have done for some time. Ever since leaving, well, really, I would put it back to 2008 and the financial crisis. I don't think the UK has recovered from that. I have a personal view on what should have happened after that, but it was just different to what the government did. So 2008, I would put it back to, and then obviously leaving Brexit, the country hasn't been sufficiently innovative to take advantage of the opportunity. Yes, it's a crisis in some ways leaving Europe, but at the same time, we haven't been sufficiently innovative with the freedom that we now have, and I think that's a missed opportunity at the moment. Not sure I answered that question thoroughly enough.
No,
Forgive me if I didn't.
I think there's some good points made there. Just in terms of geopolitical risks, then, with internet cables being cut between Finland and Sweden and the Baltic states, and easy sabotage like that can have a big impact. What's being done perhaps to protect against that?
Well, that you've got there's and I'm happy to share this with people if they want to connect with me. There's a very good person, a former White House staffer who now resides in London. She's got a podcast called Pippa, and she unfortunately it's behind one of these paywalls, which is always a bit annoying. And she speaks a lot about, so you've got space, you've got the Antarctic, and you've got things like the cables being cut. So what's being done about that you'll have an increased amount of activity by the likes of MI6 and the security services to try and find out what's happening around that. And again, you're probably looking at resiliences. So if that goes down, if one line goes down, what's our backup line? And that really hasn't been thought about for a very long time. But the cost of putting down these lines is obviously extremely high. So we all need to think about if this, then that. If we lose power, what do we do there? And what if that backup system fails? There's not a lot of information in the public realm about what's necessarily being done directly about that. Pretty sure there's quite a lot being done, particularly in the intelligence services. But again, those kind of edge case examples If you wanted to get in contact with me, I will share with you the Pippa podcast, as I say, this White House staffer who writes extensively on those things. And the interesting frontier, for me at least, is space and what's being done there. And that, again, is where there's a lot of potential conflict. It's not something I picked up on here because it's a bit on the edge, but it's certainly an area that could be one area for conflict.
Yeah. And a recent change has been the talk of a possible ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And some are seeing that as a sign of weakness by the West. Can we unpack that a little bit? Why is it seen as a weakness? Because we've actually stood up for Ukraine, but what we're trying to do is end the bloodshed.
Yes. So it depends on the framing of it, and you're right. You could say that we've been successful. However, Russia has gained a lot more territory over the last year, and the fear to some degree is that Trump will come in and pack it up and effectively say, I just want a deal. I want to close this off now. You two bang heads together. He won't want an extraction like that we saw from Iraq. He won't want to see us leaving Afghanistan. Sorry, he won't see us want to see us that kind of deal, that bad deal being done. But it's a signal because he works. This is what commentators say. He works on a transactional basis. He doesn't necessarily see grey, and it's that grey. It's the bit of the 2013, the failure of Obama to impact the red line or to enforce the red line. And again, this would be seen potentially as a weakness. So going back to Professor Michael Clark, who was saying there, if a deal done isn't a good deal and it's seen as us being weak, I personally think that any deal which sees Russia still retaining territory there will be seen as a failure from the West's part, and it will give license to others. And that's why we see many other nations, well, like Poland, for example, arming because they fear for their security.
Yeah, because they're right on the border there, aren't they? Yeah, and I've heard that from people in Warsaw. Anyway, that concludes all the questions we had there. And thank you very much, Andrew. It's been fascinating and some really useful some useful insights there as well. So thank you to all of those who attended and particularly those who provided questions. As I said before, there'll be a feedback survey coming round later on, and you will also have a recording of this webinar. So enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much, Andrew.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.